The man who couldn't be beaten is losing. Not by much. Not in a way that shows up in the record books. But in the margins. For 2 years, Scottie Scheffler has lived in a world of his own making. A reality where the laws of golf didn't seem to apply to him the way they did to everyone else. He didn't just win. He dominated. He made the best players on the planet look ordinary. He was the closest thing we'd seen to the Tiger Woods of old, and the numbers didn't just support that claim. They screamed it. Every time his name was near the top of the leaderboard on a Sunday, the outcome felt like a foregone conclusion. It was the kind of inevitability that makes legends and breaks the spirits of those who have to chase them. He was a force of nature, a machine built to win golf tournaments. The sport had found its new king, but something is different now. The machine has a few gears grinding in a way they never used to. The man who was once unbeatable is now just very hard to beat. He's missed his first cut in nearly 4 years, a streak that was almost as legendary as the wins themselves. He started rounds slow, leaving himself too much to do. The putter, once a weakness that he overcame with sheer brilliance, has betrayed him at the worst possible times, turning chances into near misses. The question is no longer, how many will he win? The question is he still the same player? And the answer is a lot more complicated than you think. This isn't a story about a golfer who has lost his way. This is a story about what happens when gravity finally catches up to greatness. This is the story of a king whose throne is suddenly not as stable as it once was. Welcome to the year Scottie Scheffler stopped winning. And then he missed the cut. It was his first missed cut in 42 starts. It was his first missed cut in nearly 4 years. The streak was over. The machine had finally spit out a bad number, and the golf world paused, blinked, and tried to process what it had just witnessed. It was like watching the sun fail to rise. For the rest of the field, it was a small victory, a reminder that even the best were human. For Scheffler, it was something else entirely. It was the first real evidence that the armor he wore was not impenetrable. The narrative around him began to shift almost immediately. The sports writers who had spent the last 2 years describing his dominance now started to search for answers. What was wrong? Was it his game? Was it his head? Was it the relentless pursuit of perfection finally catching up to him? But Scheffler, in his typical fashion, offered a disarmingly simple explanation. He said the only thing that had really changed was the number of chips he had been eating on the golf course. It was a classic Scheffler deflection, a way to take something massive and monumental and shrink it down to something small and manageable. He wasn't panicking. He was eating chips, but a missed cut is not a chip. It's a crater, and the golf world had just stumbled into it. The problem, however, wasn't just one bad tournament. It was the slow erosion of the very weapons that had made him the most feared player on the planet. For years, the weakness in Scheffler's game was the putting. It was the one crack in the armor, a statistical oddity for a man who could do everything else at an elite level. But he overcame it with his ball striking. He was so incredibly good from tee to green that he could afford to miss a few putts. He was giving himself so many chances that eventually, the law of averages would kick in. Now, the law of averages was working against him. During his hot streak, his putter was a weapon. Now, it was a liability. The stats were starting to tell a troubling story. On the PGA Tour, he was ranked 144th in strokes gained putting among the top 200 players. In the 2026 season, his iron play had fallen out of the top 100. The very tools that had built his empire were starting to show signs of decay. He was still great, but he was no longer godlike. The commentators and analysts started to pick up on the subtle shifts in his game. They saw a player who was suddenly grinding for pars instead of hunting birdies. They saw a player who was leaving the door open just a crack, instead of slamming it shut. The pressure that he had always seemed to thrive under was now starting to feel like a weight. He was no longer the hunter. He was the hunted, and everyone could smell blood in the water. For Scottie Scheffler, the question was no longer about winning. It was about survival. And the next chapter of his story would test that survival in a way he never expected. There is a paradox at the heart of professional golf, a strange and brutal irony that the people at the very top understand better than anyone. The higher you climb, the heavier the fall. The more you win, the more people expect you to keep winning. And for Scottie Scheffler, who had done the impossible for so long, the weight of his own success was starting to become unbearable. The numbers told the story of a man who was still, by every measurable metric, the best player on the planet. He led the FedEx Cup standings by a staggering 795 points over the player in second place. He had the lowest scoring average on tour, a stat that had become so routine it was almost boring. He had finished in the top 5 11 times across 17 starts in 2026. He was still Scottie Scheffler, but the wins weren't coming. And in the world of elite sports, that is all that matters. The turning point, the moment when the narrative shifted from what's wrong to what's different, came at the Travelers Championship. Scheffler had a lead. He was in control. And then he let Viktor Hovland chase him down. He lost in a playoff. A year ago, even a few months ago, that tournament would have been his. He would have found a way, pulled a rabbit out of the hat, done what he always did. This time, the rabbit didn't show up. The pattern repeated itself at the RBC Heritage, where he lost in another playoff. Then the Cadillac Championship, another second-place finish. And then the 3M Open, where a 21-year-old rookie named Jackson Koiven, playing in just his third tournament as a professional, held off Scheffler and beat him by 3 strokes. Koiven shot a 61 on Saturday, surged into the lead, and never looked back. Scheffler shot an 8 under 63 on the final day, a brilliant round, the kind of round that used to be enough. It wasn't. He finished second again. These were not bad performances. They were, by any reasonable standard, spectacular. But for Scheffler, they were something else entirely. They were evidence of a subtle but significant decline. His approach play, once his superpower, had dropped from first on tour to 8th. He was still incredible, but he was no longer superhuman. The margins he had lived by were now working against him. The result was a player who was visibly frustrated on the course. At the Genesis Scottish Open, with his 4-year cut streak on the line, he was seen muttering to himself, his face etched with a frustration that was uncharacteristic for a man known for his stoicism. He missed a 6-foot putt on the final hole to miss the cut by 2 shots. He had gone from being the most consistent player in the world to missing the weekend. The streak was over. When asked about it, Scheffler gave the same, measured answers he always gave. He said the margins were small, that he felt he was playing well, that he just needed to be patient. But the words didn't match the expression. The mask was starting to crack. The king was showing signs of wear, and the courtiers were starting to whisper. There is a particular kind of torture reserved for athletes who finish second. It is not the agony of defeat, not the crushing blow of a blowout loss. It is the quiet, nagging pain of being so close and yet so far. It is the feeling of having done almost everything right and still coming up short. And for Scottie Scheffler, the 2026 season had become a masterclass in this specific brand of suffering. By the time the calendar turned to July, the numbers had become almost absurd. 5 runner-up finishes in a single season. Only one other player in the last 40 years had managed that particular feat, and that was Cameron Young in 2022, a player who was good, but nowhere near the level of dominance Scheffler had shown. For a man who had won 14 times in the previous 2 seasons, this was not just a slump. It was a statistical anomaly. The pattern was chillingly consistent. At the Travelers Championship, he had the lead. He was in control. And then Viktor Hovland chased him down and beat him in a playoff. Scheffler had a 4-foot birdie putt on the first extra hole to keep the playoff going. He missed. The putt lipped out. A year ago, even a few months ago, that putt would have dropped. The ball would have found the bottom of the cup with the kind of inevitability that had defined his career. This time, it didn't. At the RBC Heritage, he lost in another playoff. At the Cadillac Championship, another runner-up finish. The pattern was the same every time. He would start slow, fight his way back into contention, and then fall just short when it mattered most. The statistics told the story of a man who was chasing on Sundays rather than leading. Of his 20 career victories on the PGA Tour, 75% had come when he held the lead going into the final round. In 2026, he had not been the leader after 54 holes even once. He was always the chaser, never the hunted. The 3M Open was perhaps the most painful of all. Jackson Koiven, a 21-year-old playing in just his 3rd tournament as a professional, shot a stunning 10 under 61 on Saturday to take a 3-shot lead. Scheffler responded with a brilliant final round, an 8 under 63 that would have won almost any other tournament. He made 3 straight birdies on the back 9 and added 2 more in the final 3 holes. He did everything right, and he still finished 3 shots back. The rookie had been better. It was that simple. Scheffler's post-round comments were measured, as always. He tipped his cap to Koivu and said he was proud of his own fight. But the smile didn't quite reach his eyes. The frustration was there, hidden just beneath the surface. For the first time in his career, the man who had made winning look easy was learning just how hard it could be. The numbers were undeniable. Scottie Scheffler had entered the 2026 season with the kind of momentum that made history feel inevitable. He had won 14 times in the previous 2 years, a run that had placed him in the rarest of company. He had won the Masters. He had won the PGA Championship. He had won the Open Championship. He had done everything that was supposed to be impossible. And then, somewhere between the celebration and the next tee box, the machine had started to slow. By the time the Open Championship arrived at Royal Birkdale, the narrative had shifted from, when will he win again, to will he win again? The answer, at least for the majors, was no. Scheffler finished tied for fourth, 7 shots back of the winner, Ryan Fox. He had a late push, a 67 on Sunday that showed flashes of the old brilliance. But it was never enough. The leaders were too far ahead. The chase was too long. For the first time since 2023, a major championship season had come and gone without Scottie Scheffler lifting a trophy. The disappointment was tempered by the usual Scheffler composure. He said he was proud of how he played, proud of his mental approach, proud that he had fought until the very end. But the words didn't match the statistics. His putting, once a weakness he had turned into a weapon, had betrayed him at the worst possible moments. A bogey at the 13th, a poor chip at the 15th, a missed fairway on the 18th. The margins were microscopic, but they were all it took. And yet, the most remarkable thing about Scottie Scheffler's 2026 season was not the absence of wins. It was the presence of everything else. He had finished in the top 5 11 times across 17 starts. He had 5 runner-up finishes, a number that only one other player had matched in the last 40 years. He led the FedEx Cup standings by nearly 1,000 points over the player in second place. He had the lowest scoring average on tour and ranked first in percentage of par breakers per hole. By any reasonable standard, he was still the best player on the planet. But the standard was no longer reasonable. It was a statistical impossibility, a myth that had become so ingrained in the golfing consciousness that anything less than total domination felt like failure. For 2 years, Scheffler had made winning look easy. Now, the world was learning just how hard it really was. The stats told a story of a man whose game was evolving, even if the results weren't matching the effort. His approach play, once his superpower, had dropped from first on tour to 15th. The irons that had made him untouchable were no longer firing on all cylinders. But his short game, once a secondary weapon, had become a primary one. He ranked 3rd on tour in scrambling and 4th in strokes gained around the green. He was adapting, shifting, changing. He just wasn't winning. The question on everyone's mind was whether this was a temporary blip or a permanent shift. Was Scheffler's dominance fading, or was he simply experiencing the natural ebb and flow of a career that had burned brighter than anyone could have imagined? The answer, like the man himself, was complicated. But one thing was certain. The king was no longer untouchable, and the courtiers were circling.